You're watching the novel flow now. Sherlock Holmes begins.
It was upon a fog-heavy evening in early November that I was once again reminded why life in Baker Street could never be described as ordinary. The London air pressed against the windows like a living thing, thick with soot and mystery, while the gas lamps outside glimmered faintly, their light struggling to pierce the mist. I had grown accustomed to such evenings, yet something in the silence of that night unsettled me. Sherlock Holmes sat opposite me, long limbs folded with careless elegance upon the worn armchair. His sharp profile was etched by the yellow glow of the lamp, and his eyes, those remarkable instruments of observation, were half-lidded, though I knew from experience that his mind was far from idle. Between his fingers rested his violin bow, which he drew slowly across the strings, producing a low, contemplative melody. "You are restless, Watson," he said suddenly, without lifting his gaze. I looked up from the newspaper in mild surprise. "Am I so transparent?" "To me, invariably." He allowed the bow to rest. "Your foot has tapped the carpet at intervals of precisely 7 seconds for the past 2 minutes, a sign of suppressed anticipation or unease." I smiled ruefully. "Perhaps it is the weather, or perhaps the city itself. London feels expectant tonight." Holmes's lips curved faintly. "An excellent instinct. London is always whispering, Watson. One must only learn how to listen." Before I could reply, a sharp knock sounded at the door below, cutting cleanly through the violin's fading note. Holmes straightened at once, the languor vanishing from his posture like mist before the sun. "There it is," he murmured. "The whisper takes form." Mrs. Hudson's footsteps followed, and moments later she ushered our visitor into the sitting room. The woman who entered was cloaked in dark wool, her veil drawn low. She hesitated at the threshold, as though uncertain whether to flee or remain, and when she lifted her face, I observed a pallor that spoke not merely of grief, but of fear. Holmes rose, his manner instantly courteous. "Pray be seated, madam. You have come a long way." The woman's eyes widened. "You know that already. Your boots carry the clay soil found only beyond the northern rail lines," he replied gently. "And the stitching on your gloves suggests a provincial tailor. But please tell us in your own words." She seated herself slowly, clasping her hands as though afraid they might betray her trembling. "My name is Eleanor Finch," she began. "I come from Blackwood Manor." At the name, I felt a subtle change in the room. Holmes's eyes sharpened, and even the fire seemed to crackle more attentively. "Blackwood Manor," Holmes repeated softly. "A house known more for its silence than its hospitality." Her breath caught. "Then the rumors have reached London." "Rumors travel faster than truth," Holmes said, "but they often carry its shadow. Proceed." Eleanor Finch swallowed. "My employer, Sir Alistair Blackwood, was found dead 3 weeks ago. The doctors ruled it a natural passing. His heart simply stopped. But I was there, Mr. Holmes. I saw his face." "And it told a different story," Holmes said. "Yes," she whispered. "It was the face of a man who had seen something terrible." I leaned forward. "Was there any sign of struggle, any sound?" She shook her head. "That is the worst of it. The house was utterly silent. No cry, no disturbance, just emptiness." Holmes's fingers steepled beneath his chin. "And you fear that his death was no accident?" "I fear," she said, her voice barely audible, "that the manor itself is killing us." The words lingered in the air like smoke. Holmes studied her for a long moment, his gaze not unkind, yet penetrating enough to strip away pretenses. "Miss Finch," he said at last, "houses do not kill." People do, or minds do, or sometimes fear does. Tell me what changed at Blackwood Manor before Sir Alistair's death." She hesitated. "The silence." Holmes's eyebrow rose. "An absence is rarely insignificant. Sir Alistair dismissed half the servants," she continued. "No music was permitted, no guests, even the clocks were stopped at night. He said sound invited observation." "Observation," Holmes echoed. "An interesting choice of word." She reached into her cloak and withdrew a small object, placing it upon the table. It was a pocket watch, old and ornate, its glass face cracked. "This was found in his study," she said. "It does not belong to him, and it does not work." Holmes lifted it delicately, his eyes alive with interest. "On the contrary, Miss Finch," he said, turning it so the lamplight caught the fractured glass, "it works very well indeed, just not in the way one expects." I watched as he examined the watch, noting details invisible to my untrained eye. "Watson," he said, "observe the faint residue along the inner rim." I leaned closer. "It appears crystalline." "A sedative compound," Holmes said calmly. "Odorless, slow-acting, induces cardiac arrest when combined with prolonged sensory deprivation." Miss Finch gasped. "You mean he was murdered?" "I mean," Holmes replied, "that Sir Alistair Blackwood was frightened to death with precision." The room fell silent once more, but this time it was a silence heavy with revelation. I felt a familiar stirring, the thrill and dread that accompanied every new case. "Why come to us now?" I asked the woman gently. "3 weeks is a long time." Her eyes filled with tears. "Because yesterday, Mr. Holmes, the manor fell silent again, and this time I believe I am the intended victim." Holmes stood, his tall figure casting a long shadow across the room. "Then you have come at precisely the right moment." He turned to me, that unmistakable spark alight in his eyes. "Watson, prepare your things. We leave for Blackwood Manor at dawn." I folded my newspaper and rose, my unease replaced by resolve. "Another quiet house, Holmes?" He smiled thinly. "The quietest places," he said, "are often the ones screaming the loudest." Outside, the fog thickened, swallowing Baker Street whole. And as the clock struck midnight, though none of us heard it, I sensed that we had stepped once more into the path of a mind as dangerous as it was invisible. The game, unmistakably, had begun. The journey from London to the countryside was one of gradual unraveling. As the train pulled away from the choking fog of the city, I observed Holmes seated opposite me, motionless as a statue carved in thought. His long fingers were steepled beneath his chin. His eyes, half-lidded, reflected not the passing fields but some interior landscape invisible to me. "You have been silent since we left Paddington," I remarked at last. "So have you," he replied without looking up. I smiled faintly. "I lack your habit of thinking aloud." "And I," he said, "lack your habit of thinking needlessly." This was Holmes at his most unsettling, when conversation seemed an intrusion upon some intricate mental construction. The case of Blackwood Manor had taken firm root in his mind. I could sense it as one senses an approaching storm. The air charged, the quiet unnatural. Mrs. Eliza Harrow, the woman who had come to Baker Street the previous evening, had provided us with little more than a name and a look of terror poorly concealed beneath composure. Her brother, Arthur Harrow, had died within the walls of Blackwood Manor 3 weeks prior. The physician's verdict was heart failure. The coroner had found no reason to argue otherwise. Holmes, however, had disagreed before she had even finished her account. Blackwood Manor lay several miles beyond the nearest village, isolated amid rolling fields and ancient trees that bent inward as though conspiring to hide it. The carriage ride from the station was long and silent. Our driver spoke little, and when I mentioned the manor by name, his whip faltered briefly in the air. "Bad place," he muttered. "Always has been." Holmes leaned forward. "Bad in what way?" The man shrugged, unwilling or unable to elaborate. "Quiet, too quiet." The silence he spoke of greeted us long before the manor itself came into view. The birds thinned, the wind stilled, and even the wheels of the carriage seemed reluctant upon the gravel path that wound through the estate. Then, at last, Blackwood Manor emerged. It was an imposing structure of dark stone, its windows tall and narrow, its architecture severe and unwelcoming. Ivy clung to its walls like a living thing, creeping into the mortar as though attempting to claim the house entirely. The grounds were well kept, yet possessed an air of abandonment, neat but unlived. Holmes stepped down from the carriage and stood very still. "What do you see?" I asked. "Restraint," he replied, "and fear masquerading as order." The front door opened before we reached it. A man stood there, thin and pale, his posture rigid. "I am Mr. Collins," he said, "the steward. We were informed of your arrival." His eyes flicked briefly to Holmes, then to me, and then away altogether. We were shown inside. The interior of Blackwood Manor was colder than the air outside. Heavy drapes muted the daylight, casting the hall in a permanent twilight. Our footsteps echoed too loudly, as though the house itself listened. "Does the manor always feel so still?" I asked. Mr. Collins hesitated. "The family prefers it that way." "And who precisely constitutes the family at present?" Holmes asked. "Miss Eleanor Blackwood," he replied. "She is unwell and does not receive visitors." "Of course," said Holmes softly. We were led to a sitting room where a fire burned without warmth. Tea was served by a maid whose hands trembled as she placed the cups upon the table. Holmes noticed it at once. "You needn't be afraid," he said gently. The girl flinched. Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Tell me," he continued, "how long have you been employed here?" "Since I was 14, sir." "And how old are you now?" 18. "In those 4 years," Holmes said, "how many have died within these walls?" The cup slipped from her fingers and shattered upon the hearth. Mr. Collins dismissed her at once, his face rigid with disapproval. "An unfortunate accident," he said. "The staff is prone to nerves." "Understandable," Holmes replied, "given the circumstances." We were shown the room in which Arthur Harrow had died. It lay on the eastern wing, overlooking the gardens. The bed was neatly made, the furniture sparse. Nothing appeared disturbed. Holmes paced slowly, examining every detail with reverent care. "No sign of struggle," I observed. "Because there was none," he said, "at least not of the physical variety." He knelt beside the bed, his gaze fixed upon the floorboards. "Notice the scratches?" he asked. I bent closer. They were faint, thin lines gouged into the wood near the foot of the bed. "Boot marks," I ventured. "No," Holmes replied. "Fingernails." A chill crept up my spine. "Fear," Holmes murmured. "Pure, paralyzing fear." That night sleep came to me reluctantly. The manor seemed to breathe around us, its walls whispering with unseen presence. At some ungodly hour, I was roused by a sound, soft, deliberate, a footstep. I reached for the revolver Holmes had insisted I carry. The corridor outside my room was dark, yet I could discern movement, a shadow slipping along the wall. I followed. The passage led to a narrow staircase descending into the older part of the house. At its base stood Holmes, lantern in hand, his expression alert but unsurprised. "You heard it too," I whispered. "Indeed." We moved cautiously through a servant's corridor until Holmes stopped before a section of wall that appeared no different from the rest. He pressed gently. It shifted. Behind it lay a narrow passage, barely wide enough for a man to pass through sideways. The air within was stale, untouched. "A house that hides its own veins," Holmes said quietly. The passage led upward, emerging behind a tapestry in the east wing, directly above the room where Arthur Harrow had died. Holmes extinguished the lantern. "Listen," he whispered. At first there was nothing. Then a sound so faint I doubted my own senses, a whisper, not words, not breath, a low, rhythmic hum vibrating through the walls themselves. My heart hammered. "It's not mechanical," I said. "No," Holmes replied, "it's human." The sound ceased abruptly. Footsteps echoed somewhere below. Holmes replaced the tapestry and guided me silently back to our rooms. Morning brought no relief. The servants avoided our gaze. Mr. Collins appeared strained, his politeness stretched thin. At breakfast, Holmes finally spoke. "There is a hidden passage within this house," he said calmly. "One which allows its occupant to observe, to listen, and to unsettle." Mr. Collins stiffened. "I have no knowledge of such a thing." "Then someone does," Holmes replied, "and they use it to inspire terror without laying a hand upon their victim." Holmes rose. "Blackwood Manor does not kill with weapons," he said. "It kills with silence." I knew then that we had stepped beyond the bounds of ordinary crime. Whatever force haunted this place relied not on violence, but on the darkest corridors of the human mind. And it was watching us now. There are crimes that cry aloud for justice, bloody, violent, unmistakable in their guilt. And then there are crimes so quiet, so delicately executed, that the very absence of brutality becomes their greatest disguise. It was into such a silence that Sherlock Holmes now ventured with a concentration I had seldom witnessed, even in him. The morning at Blackwood Manor broke pale and reluctant, as though the sun itself hesitated to disturb the secrets lingering within its walls. A low mist clung to the ground, muffling footsteps and dulling sound, and the great house stood before us like a monument to restraint, stern, orderly, and profoundly watchful. Holmes had slept little. I knew this from the faint hollows beneath his eyes and the manner in which he stood motionless at the window, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "You hear it, Watson?" he asked quietly. I strained my ears. "Hear what, precisely?" The manor was silent in a way that felt unnatural. No birds in the hedges. No distant farm sounds. Even the servants moved as though fearful of breaking some unspoken command. We were summoned to the east wing shortly after breakfast. Mrs. Harrowby, the housekeeper whose composure had begun to fray, led us down a narrow corridor where the air felt colder, heavier. "This was Mr. Edwin Blackwood's study," she said, her voice scarcely above a whisper. Where he was found." The door creaked open. The room was unremarkable at first glance. A large oak desk, shelves of ledgers and books, a fireplace long cold, no sign of struggle, no overturned furniture, no blood. Holmes stepped inside and stopped. "A perfect death," he murmured. Mrs. Harrowby stiffened. I felt a chill pass through me. "The doctor said his heart failed," she replied defensively. "Mr. Blackwood was not young. These things do not occur," Holmes interrupted gently, with such mathematical convenience. He began to move about the room with deliberate slowness, as though walking across thin ice. He touched nothing at first, only observed. His eyes lingered on the desk, the chair, the window slightly ajar. "He was seated when he died," Holmes said, "facing the window, alone." "Yes," Mrs. Harrowby confirmed. He dismissed everyone that evening. Of his own accord, she hesitated. So he said. Holmes's gaze sharpened. People rarely choose solitude at the moment of their destruction. I examined the desk more closely. Papers were neatly arranged. An ink pen rested in its holder. Nothing suggested distress. No poison, I asked. No weapon, Holmes turned to me. That is the brilliance of it, Watson. A death without a weapon leaves no fingerprints. He approached the chair and knelt, examining the floor beneath it. Observe, he said. No signs of convulsion, no clawing at the chest, no overturned glass. Whatever killed him did so gently, almost kindly. Mrs. Harrowby crossed herself. Holmes rose and moved to the window. Outside, the ground stretched into fog-shrouded fields. Tell me, he asked, what troubled Mr. Blackwood most in the weeks before his death? She swallowed. He slept poorly. He spoke of pressure, of being watched. By whom? She shook her head. He never said, only that someone understood him too well. Holmes smiled faintly. Ah, that single sound carried more satisfaction than I liked. We left the study shortly after, and Holmes requested to see the servants' quarters. The request was met with visible discomfort. They are resting, Mrs. Harrowby protested. Then I shall be brief, Holmes replied. Truth does not require comfort. We found the servants gathered in the lower hall, 5 men and women standing rigidly, eyes cast down. Fear clung to them like a second skin. Holmes addressed them calmly. You are not accused, but you are frightened, and fear leaves traces. No one spoke. Very well, Holmes continued. Then answer me this. Did anyone hear Mr. Blackwood cry out on the night of his death? Silence. Did anyone hear raised voices, footsteps, a door opening? Nothing. Holmes nodded. Exactly. He turned away, but not before I saw one of the maids glance sharply at the footman beside her. That night Holmes insisted on walking the grounds alone. I don't like this, I said, following him despite his objections. There is a sense here, a pressure. Good, he replied. That means the criminal succeeded. The fog was thicker now, swallowing the manor's silhouette. We moved quietly, our footsteps softened by damp earth. Holmes, I said, lowering my voice, you believe Mr. Blackwood was murdered without a weapon, but how? He stopped abruptly. By the mind, Watson. He knelt beside a yew tree near the study window. Here, he said, observe the ground. I saw faint impressions, footprints partially obscured. Someone stood here, Holmes said, for some time. Watching. No, Holmes replied, being seen. I stared at him. You mean Blackwood knew he was observed, Holmes said. Night after night, a silhouette at the window, a presence, silent, predictable. Psychological torture, I whispered. Indeed, the mind, when strained properly, will complete the act itself. A sudden sound cut through the fog, a gasp, then a cry. We ran. It came from the servants' wing. We burst into a small chamber to find Mrs. Harrowby collapsed against the wall, clutching her chest. Her face was pale, eyes wide with terror. She said she couldn't breathe, one of the maids cried. She said it was happening again. Holmes knelt beside Mrs. Harrowby, his fingers at her wrist. She lives, he said sharply, for now. What happened? I demanded. Mrs. Harrowby clutched Holmes's sleeve. I saw him, she whispered, in the mirror standing behind me. Holmes's eyes flicked to the mirror. It reflected nothing but us. Did he speak? Holmes asked. No, she gasped. He never speaks. Holmes straightened slowly. A second victim, he said. But this one survives. The household doctor arrived and administered a sedative. Mrs. Harrowby was taken to her room, trembling but alive. The servants were in uproar. Panic spread like flame. That was intentional, Holmes said quietly as we withdrew. A miscalculation by the criminal or a warning? To whom? To me. We returned to our rooms, but sleep was impossible. My thoughts churned with unease. Near dawn, Holmes summoned me. "I have reconstructed the crime," he said, "so quickly." He shook his head. "Not quickly, inevitably." He paced the room. "The killer never entered the study, never touched Blackwood, never used poison or blade. Instead, he engineered fear, repetition, anticipation." "He knew Blackwood intimately," I said, "precisely knew his habits, his fears, his pride." "And Mrs. Harrowby?" "A test," Holmes replied, "or an error." "But who?" Holmes stopped pacing. "That," he said, "is the question the killer wants me to answer incorrectly." A knock sounded at the door. A constable entered, pale and shaken. "There's been a confession," he said. Holmes smiled faintly. "How disappointingly premature," he murmured. "There are moments in a man's life when certainty feels more dangerous than doubt." I sensed we had entered such a moment on the morning Holmes requested that all residents of Blackwood Manor assemble in the long gallery. The night before, Holmes had spoken little. He paced the guest chamber assigned to us, hands clasped behind his back, eyes distant, as though observing scenes invisible to me. When I ventured a question, he silenced it with a raised finger, not impatiently, but with grave focus. "The error, Watson," he murmured at last, "is assuming the weapon must be physical." I slept poorly, troubled by dreams of empty corridors and doors that refused to open. The gallery was a severe room, oak-paneled, narrow-windowed, its portraits of stern ancestors glaring down like silent judges. The household gathered reluctantly. Mrs. Blackwood, pale and composed to the point of brittleness. Mr. Hale, the estate solicitor, eyes restless behind steel spectacles. Edgar Finch, the head servant, stiff as carved stone. And young Clara Weatherby, the lady's companion, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles blanched. Holmes stood at the center, his presence commanding without a word. I noticed how the silence bent around him as though the room itself waited for instruction. "Thank you for attending," Holmes said at last. "What I am about to describe concerns the recent death of Mr. Theodore Blackwood and the attempt upon the life of Miss Weatherby." A sharp intake of breath rippled through the room. "I shall be direct," Holmes continued. "The cause of death was not illness, nor accident, nor poison in the conventional sense." Mrs. Blackwood swayed slightly. Finch moved to support her, but she waved him away. "You are accusing someone of murder," Mr. Hale demanded. Holmes smiled faintly. "I am accusing someone of method." He began not with events, but with habits. "Mr. Blackwood," Holmes said, pacing slowly, "was a man of strict routine. He rose at 6, walked the eastern corridor at precisely 20 past, drank tea in the blue sitting room, always alone." He stopped before one of the portraits. "Isolation," Holmes said, tapping the frame. "The first condition." I watched Clara Weatherby's eyes flicker. "Mr. Blackwood was informed repeatedly and convincingly that his death was imminent." Mrs. Blackwood gasped. "That is absurd." "Is it?" Holmes replied calmly. "Letters were delivered, anonymous yet intimate. They referenced childhood incidents only a close confidant could know. They predicted symptoms, palpitations, breathlessness, dread." He turned sharply. "And what happened, Mrs. Blackwood, when your husband began experiencing these symptoms?" she faltered. "The doctor said it was anxiety." "Indeed," Holmes nodded. "Anxiety-induced," Mr. Hale scoffed. "You cannot frighten a man to death." Holmes' eyes flashed. On the contrary, the human mind, when convinced of its own demise, can command the body with terrifying obedience. He explained how Mr. Blackwood had been subjected to a progression, suggestion layered upon suggestion. Whispered warnings from servants, a locked door that should have been open, a candle extinguished at the exact moment fear peaked. No blade pierced him, Holmes said softly, but his heart obeyed the command it had been given. The gallery was deathly still. "And Miss Weatherby?" I asked, unable to restrain myself. Holmes inclined his head. The experiment continued. Clara's face drained of color. She was told, subtly, that she too was weak, that the air of the manor made women faint. That another girl had died once under similar conditions. "That is not true," Finch whispered. "No," Holmes agreed, "but belief does not require truth, only repetition." He turned suddenly to Clara. "You collapsed on the stairwell because you expected to." Tears streamed down her cheeks. I heard footsteps behind me. You thought you were not alone," Holmes finished gently. "And your body complied." Mrs. Blackwood sank into a chair. "This is madness," she said. "Who would do such a thing?" Holmes did not answer. Instead, he looked at Mr. Hale. The solicitor stiffened. "Why are you staring at me?" "Because," Holmes said quietly, "you understand inheritance law and patience and the advantage of deaths that appear natural." Mr. Hale laughed, a brittle sound. "You have no proof." "Not of identity," Holmes agreed. "Only of method." He turned to all of them. "The killer did not need to be present. They needed only proximity, trust, and time." A pause. "And yet," Holmes continued, "someone miscalculated." He gestured to the far end of the gallery. "The locked night door." Finch's breath caught. "It was locked from the inside," Holmes said. "A simple mistake. Fear thrives on uncertainty. Certainty breaks the illusion." Mr. Hale's face darkened. "You are speculating," he snapped. Holmes smiled thinly. "Am I?" Before further words could be exchanged, the door burst open. A constable entered, breathless. "Miss Weatherby, she's collapsed again." We rushed to the corridor. Clara lay pale against the wall, eyes fluttering, breath shallow. Holmes knelt at once. "She is alive," he said sharply. "Fetch water, open the windows." He leaned close to her ear. "You are not dying," he said firmly. "This ends now." Her breathing steadied, slowly, miraculously. I stared at Holmes in awe. "You see, Watson," he murmured to me, "belief can be undone as surely as it is created." When Clara was carried away, Holmes turned back to the assembled household. "There will be no arrest today," he announced. Mr. Hale smirked. "But understand this," Holmes continued, voice cold as iron. "The architect of this crime has been observed, every letter, every suggestion, every whisper." He met Hale's eyes squarely. "And the next move is mine." That evening, as fog crept once more around Blackwood Manor, Holmes stood alone at the window. "You know who it is," I said quietly. "Yes." "Why not name them?" Holmes' reflection stared back at us both. "Because, Watson," he replied, "to expose such a mind without trapping it is to teach it how to improve." The manor fell silent once more, but now I understood. The silence was no longer empty, it was waiting. It is a peculiar thing how silence may shout more loudly than any sound. On the third night at Blackwood Manor, the quiet lay upon the house like a held breath, unnatural, watchful, and strained. Even the wind, which had previously whispered through the bare trees, seemed unwilling to disturb the air. I confess that I slept little, for the darkness itself felt attentive, as though it listened for some unguarded movement of the soul. Holmes, by contrast, was wakeful long before dawn. I found him seated at the narrow escritoire in the east chamber. His tall figure bent forward, fingers steepled beneath his chin. The lamp beside him burned low, casting sharp shadows upon his hawk-like features. His eyes were alight, not with excitement, but with the cold serenity that always preceded action. "You are awake early," I ventured. "I have not slept," he replied calmly. "Sleep, my dear Watson, is a luxury for minds not burdened by symmetry." "Symmetry, patterns," he corrected softly, "and patterns, once fully visible, demand to be completed." I drew nearer, lowering my voice instinctively, though the corridors beyond were empty. "You believe the killer is still among us." Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he rose, crossed to the window, and parted the heavy curtain by a mere inch. "I believe," he said at last, "that our adversary has made one fatal error. They have mistaken silence for invisibility." The household awoke under an unspoken tension. No one raised their voice. No servant lingered in the halls. Meals were taken quickly and without conversation. It was as though Blackwood Manor itself had issued an unholy command: do not speak. Do not be noticed. Holmes watched them all. Mrs. Holloway's hands trembled as she poured tea. Mr. Finch avoided the corridors near the west wing. Young Elinor, poor, pale child, had not left her room since the near-fatal incident 2 nights prior. And always, always, there was that same oppressive stillness, as if the house feared its own echo. By midday, Holmes made his decision. "We shall lay a trap," he announced quietly as we stood in the long gallery where portraits of the Blackwood lineage stared down with vacant disdain. "A trap," I echoed. "One constructed not of steel or rope," he said, "but of expectation." The plan was simplicity itself, and therefore devilishly effective. Holmes instructed the servants that he would depart the manor that very evening, having reached no decisive conclusion. He allowed the message to spread naturally, knowing full well that fear is the most efficient courier. By supper, every inhabitant of the house believed our investigation at an end. I confess, Watson though I am, that even I was uncertain whether Holmes truly intended to leave. "You are playing a dangerous game," I said as we walked the gravel path beneath the dying light of afternoon. Holmes smiled faintly. "Dangerous only to those who rely upon control. Our opponent does. And if they do nothing—" "They must," he replied. "Silence, once disrupted, demands correction." That evening, Holmes retired early, making a deliberate show of packing his instruments. I assisted him loudly, allowing the servants ample opportunity to observe. At precisely 10 o'clock, he extinguished his lamp. Then, without a word, he slipped silently from his room and vanished into the heart of Blackwood Manor. I remained behind, my revolver close at hand, heart pounding louder than I dared admit. The minutes stretched into an eternity. The manor groaned softly, as old houses do, yet every sound seemed magnified by the tension. It was shortly after midnight that I heard it. Footsteps. They were light, careful, but unmistakably human. They moved not along the main corridor, but through the servants' passage that led toward the west wing. I followed. The darkness was nearly complete, broken only by a thin ribbon of moonlight seeping through a cracked window. I rounded the corner just in time to see a figure pause before the door of Elinor's chamber. A gloved hand reached into a pocket. "Do not proceed." Holmes' voice cut through the dark like a blade. The figure froze. Holmes stepped forward into the moonlight, his face pale and resolute, eyes fixed upon the intruder with piercing clarity. "Your mistake," he continued, "was assuming that silence conceals intent. In truth, it reveals it." The figure turned slowly. It was Mr. Finch. The butler's face, usually composed and deferential, had collapsed into something raw and desperate. His lips trembled, not with guilt, but with fury. "You do not understand," he hissed. "Oh, I understand perfectly," Holmes replied. "You did not kill with poison or blade, you killed with suggestion, with fear, with timing." I stepped forward then, revolver raised. Finch laughed bitterly. "They were weak." "No," Holmes corrected. "They were vulnerable, and you exploited the mind." Holmes spoke then with the calm authority of a lecturer, dismantling the crime piece by piece. The first victim, Lord Blackwood, had not died of natural causes, but of terror induced by calculated psychological pressure. Subtle changes in his environment, locked doors left ajar, whispers planted through servants, a carefully delivered suggestion of hereditary madness. The second attempt on a leaner had been rushed. Finch feared discovery. He misjudged her resilience. "You relied upon the manor's silence," Holmes said, "to amplify fear, but silence cuts both ways. Tonight it exposed you." Finch's shoulders sagged. The fight drained from him like blood from a wound. "I only wished to restore order," he murmured. "The family was decaying. I was protecting the house." Holmes' gaze hardened. "You were protecting your illusion of control." The authorities arrived before dawn. Finch was taken quietly, no struggle, no outcry. The manor remained still, but the silence had changed. It was no longer oppressive. It was exhausted. As the sun rose, fog retreated from the grounds like a defeated army. Light touched the windows once more. I found Holmes standing alone in the garden, hands clasped behind his back. "You did not reveal his name to me until the end," I said. "No," he replied, "because identity was irrelevant until the method was exposed. Once the illusion collapsed, the man followed naturally." He turned toward the house. "Victory," he added softly, "is rarely loud." That evening, as we prepared to leave Blackwood Manor, I could not help but glance back at its towering silhouette. "Will the silence ever truly lift?" I asked. Holmes considered this. "No," he said, "but it will no longer deceive." And with that we departed, leaving behind a house that had learned at last to speak the truth. The fog that morning lay thick upon the countryside, not drifting so much as clinging, heavy, damp, and reluctant to part with its secrets. Blackwood Manor rose from it like a specter recalled unwillingly from memory. Its dark stone walls beaded with moisture, its windows pale and watchful, as though the house itself awaited judgment. Holmes stood beside me at the iron gates, his tall figure motionless, his profile sharp against the gray veil. He had scarcely spoken since dawn. In his hand he turned his pipe, unlit, an omission I had learned to recognize as significant. When Holmes forgot his pipe, it was because his mind burned hot enough without it. "It will end quietly, Watson," he said at last, "as all clever crimes prefer to do." "Quietly," I echoed. "After all that has occurred here," he glanced at me, eyes keen but tired. "Noise is for the innocent and the foolish. The truly guilty crave silence." We passed through the gates and approached the manor. No servant appeared to announce us. That, too, was deliberate. Holmes had ensured it. Blackwood Manor had been transformed overnight, not in structure, but in spirit. The servants had been dismissed under the pretense of a family emergency, their loyalty purchased with a mixture of fear and coin. Only 3 people remained within those walls, Holmes, myself, and the criminal knew it. Inside, the air was colder than the fog without. Our footsteps echoed down the long corridor, past portraits whose eyes seemed too alive for comfort. Holmes paused before the great hall and laid a hand upon my arm. "Observe carefully, Watson," he murmured. "This is the moment where intellect must bow to human weakness." The great hall was empty, save for a single chair placed at its center. Upon it lay a sealed letter. Holmes smiled faintly. As expected. He opened it without ceremony and read silently. I watched his face closely. Whatever he found there did not surprise him. "A confession?" I asked. "An attempt at one," he replied. "False, incomplete, and quite unnecessary." He folded the letter and placed it in his pocket. "Our adversary believes that control may yet be regained through narrative, a common failing among intelligent criminals. They imagine the story matters more than the truth." "Then where are they?" Holmes gestured toward the east wing. "Waiting, listening, calculating whether silence will save them." We proceeded up the staircase, each step deliberate. Halfway down the upper corridor, Holmes stopped abruptly. "Do you smell that, Watson?" I inhaled. "Oil, lamp oil." "Indeed, and why light lamps in daylight unless one wishes to draw attention or destroy evidence?" He advanced swiftly now, his long strides eating the distance until we reached the final door. It stood ajar. Within sat Eleanor Blackwood. She was composed, too composed. Dressed in mourning black, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze fixed upon the window where fog pressed against the glass. She did not turn as we entered. "I wondered how long it would take you," she said softly. Holmes inclined his head. "Longer than you hoped, shorter than you feared," she smiled faintly. "You have an infuriating way with balance, Mr. Holmes, an occupational hazard." I studied her closely now, seeing with new eyes the details Holmes had long since marked. The controlled breathing, the tension at the jaw, the stillness of one accustomed to observation rather than participation. "You need not pretend any longer," Holmes continued. "The manor is empty, the trap is closed." She rose slowly and faced us. "Then speak, end it." Holmes did not immediately comply. Instead, he walked to the window, peering out into the fog as though addressing the world beyond her. "You did not kill with weapon or poison," he said calmly. "You killed with certainty." Her eyes flickered. "You studied your victims," he went on, "their fears, their habits, their private guilt. You whispered truths they already half believed, pressed upon doubts that had long fermented in silence. You did not strike them, you convinced them that resistance was futile." "You are describing persuasion," she said coolly, "not murder." "On the contrary," Holmes replied, turning now, "you engineered despair so precisely that the body merely followed where the mind had already gone." She laughed softly, though there was no mirth in it. "A brilliant theory." "And demonstrable fact," Holmes returned. "Your first victim suffered no physical harm, yet his heart failed after a night spent in absolute psychological torment. Locked not by doors but by conviction. The second survived only because doubt interrupted your design.